UniverSoul Women, and this is Sherryl Lin.
And I'm Julie Krull, and we come together to ignite radical cultural change. Welcome to our show today. So, well-behaved women never make history. Sherryl, you brought this topic up. What does that mean? Who said that? Well-behaved women never make history.
So I Googled it because I know that that quote has been attributed to different women. So I thought I would just start us off by reading from a website called professorbuzzkill.com. So they
Buzzkill.
yeah. So from this page, it says lots of people are credited with the coining the great phrase, well-behaved women rarely make history. They include Marilyn Monroe, Gloria Steinem, Eleanor Roosevelt, Anne Boleyn, and our own Aunt Ginger from Buzzkill Institute. Given time, any powerful woman with a backbone and nerve will get credit for this phrase and sentiment. And so it says, it's a great quote, but we should credit its actual author. And we're so happy that it came from an academic scholar, Laurel Thatcher Ulrich, who is a professor of early American history at Harvard. Professor, I'll skip a little bit ahead. She published an important article in the spring 1976 issue of the Journal American Quarterly, and its title was Virtuous Women Found, New England Ministerial Literature. I think that's enough for the...
Virtuous Women Found. Virtuous. So you and I have had this conversation a lot lately. Okay, we've talked about the good little girl, the good girl syndrome, pleasing people. I spent so much time in my life being the good little girl, being the virtuous one, I remember I was nicknamed in one of my in my early career in a corporation as the one with integrity, the one with, what was the other word that they would use? So if they needed someone that would really uphold integrity, it would be like, okay, call on Julie, so this good little girl, this people pleasing, the wanting to be liked. I mean, that's really what's under it, right? Like, yeah, I want to come off in a certain way, but I want to be liked. So we've talked a lot about this. And this quote is really interesting because it's inviting us to break out of that shell. Like, well-behaved women never make history. Now, do we want to make history? It's not really about making history, but it's saying something about what is well-behaved women? What is well-behaved women? And what does this really mean to us?
Yeah, and it's not really about making history, but it is, for many of us, about making an impact where we know that we're here on the planet to do something, to bring something, to use our creativity, to use our voice, to whatever our mission is here on Earth, that we want to be able to fulfill that in an unencumbered way. And it feels like there's all these definitions of how we're supposed to be because we're women, and it starts from the time that we're little girls. That, I remember having to wear I don't know if you remember going places when I was a kid, and we'd have to wear dresses, and there'd be like the greatest playground or, a water park or something like that. And I couldn't get my dress dirty, or I couldn't, like why wasn't I allowed to wear pants so that I could play and have fun? So that kind of keeping us in this good girl image, I think is really, it's been around for a long time in my life. I know that.
What's interesting is your story of the expectations, the cultural expectations of you being a good girl. And so I'm checking in with you to see if it was externally put on you. Mine was internal. My good little girl, it wasn't that people were teaching me how to be a good little girl. I don't remember it that way, and I don't embody it and experience it that way. I experience my good little girl from within, an internal expectation to fit in, to be normal, to like literally, because I was the ragamuffin, right? I was this, I didn't look pretty on the playground in a dress. I'm showing up and wanting to be seen as that normal or acceptable or whatever, as that good little girl. So mine was very internally driven. Was yours externally driven?
I think it was both. I mean, my mom was kind of all about looks, like everything had to look good on the outside. And her children, of course, were a reflection of that. So we had to be dressed a certain way. And so there was that. But when you said that about internal, I realized there was also, I was definitely the peacekeeper in the family. My parents really fought a lot, and there was a lot of upheaval within our family, but we had to look good on the outside, right? But then there was the other part of me that, I thought, well, if I can just, be a good little girl, then they'll stop fighting. If I can be a good little girl, then, maybe it'll distract them from, being mean to each other, or somehow they'll pay attention to me. Cause I think it was more of a neglect thing when I was a kid. They didn't really pay attention because they were too busy fighting. So being a good little girl meant maybe I'll get a pat on the head for being a good girl. And that was the way I got attention. So there was that part too.
Mm. So how does this extend into our adulthood? Because I'm sitting here thinking about how I found my voice and developing the authentic voice, the more heart-centered voice, and what that really means about my storytelling. Because as I'm listening to you talk about like the fighting in the home, and if you were a good little girl, maybe they'd stop fighting. A lot of that need to be perfect, need to appear a certain way, having the behavior of the good little girl was to hide the dysfunction that was on the inside. For me, it was to be more normal and be more embodied normal so that I was not that. So as I grew into adulthood, there still was this need, especially when I started writing my book. Years ago, I began writing from the academic, from the professional, from the licensed medical, person, from the PhD, and I began to have this scholarly, cognitive voice that would uphold all those labels that would come from that place. And I could never get beyond a few chapters. Like every time I would sit down, okay, here's the book, here's the structure, here's what it's going to speak of. And I had this scholarly teaching thing that wanted to cite everything and bring in all these people and look at the research. And it wasn't my authentic voice. And I think of that voice as needing approval too. That voice needed professional approval. That voice needed the audience approval. That voice wanted to be not authentic. What's the word I'm looking for, Sherryl? To be validated and affirmed, like it was okay to speak if I came from that scholarly place. So I carried that into my profession. I think from the good little girl to now, I think I'm breaking out of it. And hopefully this podcast is part of breaking out of it. And hopefully in further expressions will evolve. But in writing my book, I literally, like the book wrote me and the voice spoke through me, and I let something else happen that wasn't about pleasing anymore. I mean, there's a lot of topics in my book that I would be like, oh, what if they judge me for that? And I think I broke through that. Now, I'm not a radical. I don't know that it's in my bones to stir things. I think that I'm this voice of the whole, and so I hold this element or essence of wholeness in that inclusivity and what have you. But I don't think, I don't know if that means I'm still a well-behaved woman, or if that means that I keep this inclusive voice. But I I don't see myself with this radical that wants to come out and
What,
I
what
don't
does,
know.
I'm going to interrupt you. What does radical mean to you? Because we have that in part of our, in our tagline, it says radical. So what does that mean to you then? How are
Yeah,
you radical?
radical, like, yeah, what is the radical? So like when we're igniting radical cultural change, I think it as real and big and the radical, like the expression of let us wake up to understand cultural change here and step into it in a radical way. When I think of my voice, I don't know, I'm listening to you and we've had this experience when I've had you on my radio show, you've like taken a step back and said, okay, I'm not going to use this language to talk about this. I let you know too on my radio show. One time I had a guest on, and in the title of the book, it had F with explicitives as part of the title of the book. And I was asked to change that because if we offend one listener, we have offended all. So we just don't even try to offend one listener. So when I think about my voice, I don't know that, I don't know. I remember my mother never cussed or swore. And I never said a naughty word. I even call them naughty words. Like they're naughty words. And so when I use one, people listen. Like I will have a few words, and it's kind of fun to say them once in a while. And when I do, my family will be like, "Oh, mom just said that word. Let's listen." Like it's used in that way, and I'm much more comfortable saying that. But I guess that's what I'm thinking. I don't know. What are you thinking? I know there's this part of you that's ready to just roar out and be a part of this literally non-censorship anymore, non-oppression of what would come out if you were really free.
I think, it's funny because I was in this women's circle this past weekend, and there were a couple of women who I noticed, said the F word regularly. It was peppered throughout there. And I've been like that at times, but I realized it took the power away from it. George Carlin did this skit years ago where he did this whole bit about the F word. And then I remember him saying, it's a majestic word. It was very funny. And I thought, it's, for me, the important thing is, first of all, judgment. That we judge each other by our language, whether we, it's not even about expletives. It can be about your accent or proper grammar or, judging people that have an accent from another country and that they're not speaking English properly. There's all this judgment of each other. And I think when it comes down to it, I enjoy my friends that have a little bit more colorful language. It's not exactly me. I'm probably somewhere in the middle. But as an example, the Women's March when everyone was wearing those pink pussy hats, and I don't know about you, but when I was a kid, a pussy was a cat. It wasn't women's genitals. And I was taught that wasn't a nice word for women's genitals. And, and it just was, and for a long time, it kind of made me uncomfortable when women would use that word, or, when a man would use that word. And then there's the whole derogatory thing where people, call usually a guy, they'll call him a pussy if he's being wimpy, right? It became an insult. And so that's very confusing. If you're using that word as an insult, and then also an endearing term for women's genitals, but it makes some people uncomfortable. And then you have all these women wearing these hats and calling them pussy hats. Are they pussy cat hats or are they pussy hats? So, and then, the whole comment that our president made, that got repeated over and over and over again about grabbing one. And the bottom line for me is is to look at this point. I feel like the way that we're radical is we blow the doors wide open and look. We look at our language. We look at our judgment of our own language, a judgment of ourselves. If I feel uncomfortable, is it because, no, that doesn't feel right for me? Like for me, like you said, you know, I feel like, no, I'm more of a holistic, and I don't need to be walking around, you know, using expletives and, or so is it just that as we get to know ourselves and who we truly are, then it's up to us what kind of language we want to use. But when we start judging someone else because of their language, that's another story. And I think that being radical means you listen when someone says, no, we need to reclaim this word, or we need, you know, this word has been twisted and the meaning, you know, is now, you know, being used in a derogatory way, and that's not right, you know. So I think just being open to the conversation is what we're doing here. And I think that that is what I see as being radical, you know, that we're not going to just keep going like this about it. We're actually going to talk about it.
So the radical cultural change, I think it's really important. I just want to presence this because as I'm listening to you talk, what I'm hearing and feeling with the P word now of pussy is really, I feel like men assigned it to women's genitals and men assigned it to wimpy men. Men in the patriarchal society, it feels like men created the definitions of those words and labeled us. And for me, in my experience growing up in childhood, it was a very disrespectful title for women when they would talk about it. It isn't about, it was just a sexual term that wasn't grounded in love and wholeness and respect and integrity. It really was teenage boys spouting off slang. And so then it objectified women. It objectified me, whether they were talking about my thighs or my, you know, different body parts or using that word. It became an objectification. So maybe that's why I don't like that word. Reclaiming it and wearing the pussycat hats, the pink pussycat hats, I know that that was making a statement. And I think it, to me, I could get on board with that statement when it is about the President of the United States objectifying women like that, because that's what happened in that statement when he said he could grab any woman's pussy. That's the cultural piece that I have to stand up for and say, no, not anymore. That is not an okay voice. And so I will judge that as it comes in that disrespectful way. Even calling men who are wimps pussy has the connotation of it being they're more like women than men, that men are weak. I mean, that men are strong and women are weak, the weaker gender. So yeah, radical cultural change, I think it begins with this language, and that maybe is one of those words that we redefine, recreate, or call out as a negative thing. I don't know. In the reclamation of it, can I look at it as a happily ever after word that we bring into our language again? I don't think so. And from my point of view in this moment, it's not something that I feel a need to go, yeah, I want freedom from that. To me, I want the lesson and intention that's under that to be healed, to be cleared, to be expressed. And I agree with you. Let's have the conversation about it. Let's bring up the word pussy in context of the conversations that we're having and sort through it. What does it really mean? But to me, it's a gender identification word that comes from men, for men, communicating to men about women and weak men. What do you think?
I think I've got a hair blowing on my nose. Sorry about that. What I think is, it's interesting because, and we didn't go and investigate the history of the word or anything like that before the show, but there is that makes total sense, and I can see how men have, used it and it became this thing. And I was trying to think for myself when the turning point, it was before the pussy hat thing, where in private, not in conversations with people other than myself and, my partner, I started reclaiming that word and seeing it as a sweet thing, like it's kind of an endearing thing. But that was a very personal turning point for me. And it still kind of will make my ears kind of go like this when someone says it. But it lost a lot of its charge because I just decided, you know what? I mean, I have a friend who's quite a bit older than I am. She's from England. And I remember we were talking one day and she was talking about her family back in England, and she was telling me the story, and she went along and she said, oh, and yes, and then we used to go talk to my Auntie Pussy. I just kind of went, what? And that's what they called her. It didn't mean women's genitals. It was an endearing name. And I remember when I heard it, and to her, it was funny that it had turned into having a different meaning. So, and I think that this is, again, where I think it can be an individual preference to whether you want to incorporate it and how you want to kind of take the charge out of it for yourself. I know that my kids, when we're talking about that same body part, my kids each one time called me the C word. And they only ever said it once because they knew they had crossed a line. They said a lot of, they tested, because they're kids, they tested a lot of things. But when they said that and they took a look at my face, they were like, oh, and neither of them ever used it again, So that was my line. And yet it's just a frigging, word. When you really think about it, we are the ones that assign meanings to these words. But as we're looking at changing our culture and changing the way that we treat each other, because that's really the bottom line, how we get along with each other, male and female, and not dragging, some of the darkness of our history of oppression with us. Language is an important piece of it, and looking at, how language and how we speak to each other is demeaning or helps lift us up, and I think most people would agree that it feels better to have uplifting language. So whether it's that we change some of the words and start using them so that the density of the word lessons, or we just say, no, that word does not belong. It's just got too much history to it of being derogatory.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting as I'm listening to you. So I'm holding these words, like there are some throughout history that it's time not to use those words. We have some when we look at racial relations, when we look at, we've called different races different nicknames, and so there are those that we just need to let go of. It's like, how do we dissipate the charge? And so I think of this word as one of those racial relations words of gender relations. I think it had that charge. So is it worth the energy to clear the charge and to reclaim that word? Or, like you just inspired me, is what are the more endearing words that literally we can begin to weave into a new culture that really is more inclusive, more loving, more like I'm just thinking of more universal, like UniverSoul Women, like really that holds an open container for us to see each other clearly and be transparent. And so and holding honor and respect, that I can really be transparent, and derogatory doesn't fit in that container. You know, racial slurs don't fit in that container. Judgment of gender, or, you know, remember when we used to queer, they've reclaimed queer, and in the LGBTQ community, they've reclaimed queer, and growing up to be queer was one of those derogatory words. So it's interesting that they reclaimed that, but I don't know. I'm perplexed. This is really important if we dig deeper and really hold this conversation and look at this field of how do we hold this container. Wow. And
yeah, I feel already like this is going to be an ongoing conversation as we're kind of winding down here, that it is a language is just one of the many facets of how we culturally are shifting things. And I don't think it's like it's definitely not a black and white issue. I think, and who gets to decide? That's the other thing, you know, I was thinking about that. Who gets to decide what words are appropriate and what words aren't? And that's where I think we have to look at our judgment and the feeling and the energy behind the words. Because you can say auntie pussy, and it's a very like, la, la, la. And you can, you know, look at some guy and go, oh my God, he's such a pussy. And that's a very different energy, right? So, so I think that again, I think that we're going to have more conversations on this one.
I think it's a good one. I think I agree. We have to have more conversations on this. And just to bring this into fruition, accepting our differences too, that, you know, you and I are very different people, and how this comes forward will be very different within each of us. And so I think it is an important topic. And I'm just kind of even chuckling at Auntie Pussy. Like, to me, as a kid, I wouldn't even have been able to say that. Like, I would say Auntie P or something else like that. Is just, so there's just nothing endearing about it, which makes this a great ongoing conversation, because, what is politically correct anymore? We just saw politically correct explode on, mainstream media, and we now have no definitions, right? We're not holding, like, look what's happening in our planet. So I guess it's what are we each gonna feel comfortable with moving forward and coming into some kind of common ground. So it's been a joy talking with you again, Sherryl.
Absolutely. I love it.
Okay, and if you're watching this, want to know more information, check the information out below underneath this video. You'll find our website links and a little bit more about the conversations and the UniverSoul Woman. So thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time. Bye for now.